Well, I'll go ahead and to do the little introduction so that it will give people time to come in. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to this presentation by these two young faculty members in our university who are doing such important work that relates to the community, to the physical health of the community and the mental health of Detroit. These things, those improvements don't come about miraculously, but through the hard work and dedication of people like these two young scholars. One is Allison Laskey, PhD. She is a postdoctoral fellow here at Wayne State University in the College of Social Work. She uses ethnographic methods to study how working class Black residents assert demands for equitable development and racial justice here in Detroit. In particular, she's interested in the roles that knowledge and organization play in the activism of working class Detroiters, and how factors such as historical memory, institutional dynamics, and community morale influence that activism. Additionally, her interests include sustainability and resilience of critical urban systems. A team science project funded by the National Science Foundation, Water and Health Infrastructure, Resilience and Learning, that's the title of the project, that supports Laskey's postdoctoral work, which involves conducting a nationwide survey of water and public health systems to understand their interdependencies. Erin Stanley is a doctoral student in the social work and anthropology program here at Wayne State. She works as a graduate research assistant on an NFS interdisciplinary study entitled Water and Health Infrastructure Resilience and Learning, the same project that Allison is working on. She's also a research assistant and active member with the Coalition for Property Tax Justice in Detroit. Her research interests include studying and conceptualizing experiences around place-based belonging, dismembership, and remembering as they relate to property tax foreclosures, residential housing demolitions, and development in Detroit. She's also interested in the relationship between reparations policy and collective healing, in how grassroots coalitions function, and in examining cultural foundations of interconnected social and ecological crises. She received a Bachelor of Science in Human Services from Loyola University in Chicago, a Master of Arts in Social Foundations of Education from Eastern Michigan University. And to prove that she's smart in various places, she also has a Master of Social Work from Wayne State University. Her professional activities or professional experiences involve various community-based roles, including outreach case management to people experiencing homelessness, complex medical care management, youth empowerment, and environmental education. So you see you're in the presence of two up-and-coming scholars who are making a contribution to the physical and mental and medical health of Detroit. Today, they are going to give a presentation together entitled Reimagining Resilience as Multidisciplinary, Multi-Level, and Interconnected. So please welcome to the virtual podium, Allison, Laskey, and Erin Stanley. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that really lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's great to see your faces or your blocks, your squares on the screen. And it's people that we've worked with closely and a little more distant, and also some people that that I haven't gotten to meet, but I'm looking forward to connecting with as well. Erin, do you want to go ahead and start the presentation?
Sure.
So today, Erin and I will be mostly presenting to you, but we've been working on a writing team with Khairul Islam and Matt Seeger, Dean of Class, that will say a few words as well at the beginning. And all of this is part of a larger interdisciplinary team that we're working on, the Water, Health, Infrastructure, Resilience, and Learning, the WORLD team. So the resilience paper itself is working through some of the issues that the WORLD team has faced in terms of the conceptual plurality and lack of concrete definitions of resilience, which is really a guiding driver of how do we provide water and public health to the public. So this paper is trying to broadly solve a problem within research and also a specific problem for our team. So you'll see that interplay in the presentation. Before we get into the bulk of the presentation, Matt, would you like to say a few words, and then Khairul as well?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have a chance to say a few words about resilience and this really important topic, which has come to dominate a lot of the work in crisis and emergency management, particularly in the area of preparedness. And just a little context, resilience really is a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of its application to these questions of crisis preparedness and crisis response. And it really grew out of a recognition that it was not possible for large political institutions, particularly the federal government, to provide the kind of support that's necessary in a crisis situation. So rather than say the federal government is going to come in and help us in all these circumstances, the idea was to build competency for responding to crises and disasters very much at the local and community level. And so this particular approach, I think, has been really important in the sense that it's sort of a grounded theoretical perspective that really grew out of principally Hurricane Katrina and failed responses to Hurricane Katrina. So this has been a really fun project to work on with some great graduate students, and I'm looking forward to hearing their presentations. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Khairul Islam. I am a second-year PhD student in the communication program at Wayne State. And welcome all of you in our presentation, Reimaging Resilience as Multidisciplinary, Multi-Level, and Interconnected. Thank you, Allison and Erin, for allowing me to say a few words about the importance of this project. As Dr. Seeger already mentioned, like how important this actually perspective is, so resilience as a concept is well received around the world and across the discipline. So what we realize, the concept theorized from different disciplinary perspective, different ways. And we thought, it can offer much more benefit to the real world and practice if we approach resilience as multidisciplinary and as they are interconnected. So we try to theorize, and hopefully we will learn more about this throughout the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Khairul. Now we can dig into the presentation. So our goal in this paper, in this presentation, is to think about these questions. What is resilience? How is it operationalized across all these different disciplines? Why is it important? As Matt mentioned, there's a need for a global approach to risk management, as we are unable to manage crises as we were in the past. And maybe the past isn't always, it's instructive for the future, but we also have to look at the evolution of our infrastructure, the trajectory of our population, how we live in urban centers. And disciplines are differently oriented toward all of those intersecting questions, which are creating new and more extreme forms of crisis that we have to deal with. And also new and extreme baseline conditions for different populations on a regular basis that you have to express resilience, not just at a moment of crisis, but in the everyday pressures of life. As crises are more global, interconnected, there's a larger scale of disaster, there's disparate impact of disaster. Talk of resilience is all around us. And we know that everyone here has a sense of resilience, and that's one of the reasons that you're in this presentation, but also even if it's not a particular interest to you, it is something that's in the discourse, in the milieu. It's increasing in rhetoric and in implementation. So we wanted to start by getting a sense from the people who are here in our Zoom room, what is resilience to you? And Erin, you can go to the next slide.
This isn't a test. More curiosity.
And I'll add that in our world team, this has part of the reason for this paper is that it has continued to be a moving target. Mm-hmm. So, you know, these answers, this is a brainstorming where we're going to get a sense of the range that we're coming into this with.
Mm-hmm. So I see ability to make it through challenges, the ability to overcome, bouncing back after facing adversity, buoyancy, flexibility, strength, handling tough times, strength through coping, social support. Yeah, these are all kind of spot on to what we found. Stick-to-itiveness. I like that. Stick to it. Great. All right, so thank you all for providing these. I'm going to try and go forward here. The ability to maintain functioning in the face of a disruption. Perfect. Cool. So I'm going to give a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. Just to kind of situate this work, this paper that we've worked on is part of a genre that kind of following like propositions. So it builds concepts by making a series of propositions to develop a theoretical construct. It follows a model that reviews existing knowledge to then propose new ideas. So that's kind of what we're going to do with you all today. We're going to kind of go over what resilience is, talk about its applicability to drinking water systems and kind of what kind of the importance of drinking water systems and get into that a bit. And then talk about what different disciplinary approaches to resilience have been. Why isn't there already a multidisciplinary approach to resilience? And so we're going to start with, well, what are all these individual disciplines saying? And then from there, kind of synthesizing those views to propose some new reimaginings around resilience. It's not really, there we go. Okay. So what's resilience? You guys all did a great job defining it, so I can probably just skip this part. But I will say that resilience, as Allison was saying, has kind of experienced a surge in both kind of popular media discourse as well as in research. But from the early days, it's always referred to kind of like its etymological roots are kind of like to bounce back or to jump or to leap. So kind of you already have this tension of bouncing back and then also leaping forward that we'll get into a little more later. And it kind of for a few centuries was like this kind of this bouncing back or rebounding kind of term. And then it kind of expanded to different disciplinary uses in the mid-20th century, specifically through psychology in the 40s and 50s. it was described as individuals, like an individual's ability to withstand adverse conditions. So as Dr. Edwards was saying, kind of thinking about individuals' mental and physical health in the face of adversity. And then ecologists started taking it on in the 70s, kind of in the wake of the environmental movement. And engineers also kind of, and social scientists kind of started talking to a little bit more together to involve new concepts of resilience around engineering. So like resilience of human built systems, and then social ecological models of resilience, which kind of follows some thinking around social ecological systems theory. And so kind of really quintessential work on this was from Holling in the 70s, who influentially defined resilience as the measure of the persistence of systems. So namely the ability to absorb change and disturbance while maintaining key relationships between populations and their environments. And this kind of thinking and curiosity really came out of looking at ecosystems and understanding like, wow, you know, these ecosystems are able to kind of face a fire or another kind of like disaster or change or disruption and regenerate. And they were wondering like, can social systems do that? And can individuals do that? And so its application to understanding and working within social systems took two primary paths following this work in the 70s. The first is that governmental bodies themselves started adopting it as a way to further the neoliberal emphasis on self-reliance and decentralized response to collective risks, while social scientists and ecologists partnered and elaborated on the concept as a way to better understand how humans relate to their environment and the interconnectedness between social and ecological systems. So these various conceptual strands have shaped an accelerating number of studies related to resilience through these distinct disciplinary interpretations, which we'll go over later. And specifically relevant to our work is how the social ecological and engineering strands of resilience meet in the study of socio-technical systems. Municipal drinking water is an important example of a socio-technical system that requires resilience, as it exists as at the complex intersections of human behavior in the environment, political and technical decision-making, and critical infrastructure.
I'll give a little overview of the drinking water system. And the reason that we're focusing on municipal drinking water systems is that it is a complex, ecologically embedded, socio-technical system interconnected with other societal systems. So I'll say that again. We're looking, part of the premise of the quandary that our team found ourselves in was saying, if we're going to study complex systems in the real world, we have to take ourselves out of some of the boxes that we tend to stay in, whether they're disciplinary or whether they're sectoral or otherwise, even if they're, you know, class or social systems. Drinking water is ecologically embedded. You don't have drinking water unless you have source water, unless you have the planet's natural resources. So it's ecologically embedded, but it's a socio-technical system requiring social and technical components to work in an imbricated way that is also interconnected and overlapping with other societal, technical, organizational systems. And we know that water is essential for human life. It's ubiquitous, you know, everywhere that humans live, there has to be water, and it's essential. But in the past couple hundred years, it has changed enormously how humans get their water and what are the sort of population centers we have to be transported to and clean for. So looking at the material evolution of the water infrastructure system allows us to see what kind of complexities we're facing today and what has become more complex over time. The origin of the municipal drinking water system in the US has to do with urbanization and growing population centers. As the US outgrew local cisterns and wells, advances in public health revealed that contaminated water was a vector for disease. So water infrastructure, distribution, and then later treatment and disinfection evolved in response to a recurring series of outbreaks of cholera and then typhoid fever and then yellow fever outbreaks in the 1850s and 1900s, up until the 1900s. And originally water was transported from the source to these burgeoning population centers to just clean the streets out. You know, saying like, where is the disease coming from? Well, let's use water to clean it out. And as soon as there's water available to do that sort of basic decontamination, the people were also needing water for other uses, for daily regular uses. And so the water infrastructure demand ballooned really, really enormously. And what that also meant is that when the water was used, it left and it wasn't cleaned anymore. So it ended up being a contaminating factor back into the waterways. And that required building the infrastructure to clean the water. And the best, easiest way to do that was at the source. Clean the water, and then, so it developed a much more complex infrastructure rather quickly. What it did was it stopped the diseases from spreading, and it provided water to the largest US cities. By 1923, municipal water systems served 97% of the residents in the 100 largest US cities. And people were much healthier as a result. And industry and population could continue to expand. While waterborne diseases were under control, after the World War II era, there was increased industrialization, and then there ended up being chemical contaminations and a whole other set of vectors for disease that didn't have the same style of outbreaks, but actually represented longer term illnesses as well. So there were new questions, and that led to the environmental movement, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1972 and 1974, respectively, with more geographic expansion of cities, where people moved to Arizona in high-rise buildings and also expected to have the same access to water that you would if you lived on a river or on a coast. This just became a basis of the American way of life and modern way of life. So there's been a regulatory response to that, but it's complex, and there are new problems to that. We have an underfunded system in need of modernization to address failing infrastructure and an ever-increasing list of contaminants. So water quality and water provision remains one of the most essential questions on the agenda in modern times, and in need of great resilience. And what does resilience mean in response to this complex set of conditions? Well, that's one of the things that is what we set out to address in this presentation.
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself there. So we're also wondering, as I said, kind of looking at existing knowledge to make kind of further propositions, we looked at approaches to resilience within 6 disciplines that we found relevant to understanding how resilience functions within interdependent socio-technical systems, such as, for instance, drinking water. So specifically, we look at resilience scholarship within water engineering, public health, communications, political science, social work, and urban studies. And I'm going to ask Allison to type in the chat here. We're kind of wondering, obviously these aren't the only disciplines that examine resilience. We're kind of wondering who's here. If you guys can all share in the chat again, kind of what disciplinary orientation you are joining us through, or that you identify with, or that's meant something to you. And so then to look at each discipline, what we did was we review first overarching definitions in the field, and then we looked at kind of the origins of that and shifts in the thinking around resilience within each field. We also were curious about what levels of analysis these fields are employing to understand resilience, and the role of systems, like how are they, what importance do systems have in their, if any, in their conceptualizations of resilience. And additionally, we considered what these disciplinary perspectives on resilience revealed about the interconnectedness of social, ecological, and technological systems. Allison, do you want to read who we've got here?
So we have representation, we have communication, anthropology, social work and anthropology, theater, combined with that, environment and geography, social work and business, environmental science, citizen, engineer, data scientist, leading a transdisciplinary center at George Mason devoted to community resilience. So and then geology, environmental science.
Cool.
So we have great set of people here.
Awesome. These are our people. All right, so I'm going to get into the weeds a bit about some of these perspectives. So we'll start with water engineering, since we're talking about water systems. So water engineers, or the concept of engineering resilience, refers to a return to equilibrium after disruption, specifically in human engineered systems, and the ability of these human engineered systems to respond to change, tolerate collapse, and recover to some sort of normal or baseline functioning after that collapse. Water system engineers also focus on robustness as a component of resilience, which is kind of looking at a minimal deviation from the acceptable or the ideal. So like if there is a disruption, then it's only a minimal change from like the ideal functioning. And then another component they look at is reliability, which measures the system's ability to maintain that service under failure scenarios. So despite agreement on these kinds of characteristics, there's not a consistent definition looking at the complexities of the concept as well as, but there is an agreement that it's really important because of, as Allison was saying, how important water is to public health, clean water and safe water. And what's interesting about engineers is they're kind of the ones who have figured out better than a lot of other disciplines how to measure it, because they're looking at more of like the technical infrastructure component. And so they in the 80s started working with like computer generated modeling to look at how to measure whether or not a system can tolerate collapse and still maintain functioning. And so these metrics, they focus on the performance of the infrastructure, so they give us a good understanding of how that infrastructure is doing. But importantly here, they ignore the interdependencies of that infrastructure within the social systems it's performing within. And, you know, so yeah, that's just kind of important to us, is that they don't really look at the interconnectedness. But in general, the degree to which a water system minimizes the severity and duration of a water service disruption is how they measure resilience in water systems. So in public health, the concept's pretty new in public health. You know, resilience has been, you know, used to understand how people and communities achieve and sustain mental and physical health in the face of adversity. But in terms of public health kind of policy and research, it follows a guideline released by the CDC in 2011 that public health departments had to kind of talk about how they were going to measure and promote community resilience as part of their funding requirements. And in this kind of guidance, the most updated version from 2018, the CDC defines community resilience as, quote, the capacity to absorb stress or destructive forces through resistance or adaptation, manage or maintain certain basic functions and structures during disastrous events, and recover or bounce back after an event. Public health looks at multiple scales of analysis, whereas water is really looking at an engineered system, water engineering. Public health is looking at individuals, families, communities, a nation, as well as like the physical environment. As it relates to our socio-technical systems, public health systems work to enhance resilience to crisis by increasing preparedness beforehand, maintaining functioning throughout the crisis, and engaging in learning or transformation afterwards. And it really, they do look more at interdependencies and the value that resilience offers public health through supporting strong local communities and their capacity for resilience, while also highlighting the larger global forces that are impacting these local communities. All right, and then communications. This field has embraced resilience as a broad set of unifying processes, resources, and capacities. They've emerged primarily through Buzzinel's work around the communication theory of resilience, which describes social resilience as a collective process by which individuals reintegrate from some disruption and co-construct a new normal. So following this, resilience is developed and sustained through discourse, interaction, and material considerations. So a community-based approach to communications resilience suggests that it's a function of communication systems, community relationships, and then strategic communication processes between those relationships. I'll get into this. So resilience and communication highlights these key interconnections between individuals, community, and society, but it also invites creative and innovative responses to adverse conditions, specifically because communication scholars look at the broader ecosystem that resilience is occurring within and include media resources, various sources of information, as well as the infrastructure and communication between citizens and organizations and the government. So they're really looking at this kind of very complex web when they're considering resilience. And then we have political science, which resilience in political science and kind of it shows up in different state discourses and public documents dating back to the Middle Ages. But really, there's not a lot in the political science literature around resilience. It's not as popular as it is in other social science disciplines. But nevertheless, the concept has definitely gained traction in specific parts of the political science field, specifically around understanding the ability of policies to persist over time or certain regimes to persist over time, as well as how resilience can be used to design policy solutions. A lot of the scholarship in political science on resilience focuses on the response to natural disasters or technological crises. And they really look at governmental systems at various levels as their level of analysis when they're looking at resilience. For this specific project, what's most relevant is the political science definition of community resilience, which is, quote, a synthesis of local, so non-state, and government resources, which enables communities to help themselves during emergencies in ways which complement the larger centralized crisis management objective. So this approach reveals kind of the complex nature of kind of official government interventions during disaster, but also emphasizes the interconnectedness of non-state actors that are functioning within these political systems during a disaster. All right. Then we have social work, which really kind of continues on the work from psychology around resilience and has looked at it through time as an individual kind of construct and how it really grew out of that research in psychology, trying to understand how certain people who face adversity kind of bounce back better or are able to function well despite this adversity. The 4 waves of resilience research within social work kind of focus around trying to figure out what are these markers for resilience, how can we promote policies and interventions to like increase the capacity for resilience. And then figuring out, how do individuals actually develop resilience, and then expanding to the different kind of cultural contexts that resilience is happening within. So despite it being predominantly framed as an individual construct, it's also applicable to the various analytic and practice domains that concern social workers, including interpersonal, families, organizations, and communities. Social workers also conceptualize resilience as part of the kind of complex web of relationships between power-laden people and communities, so kind of following the person and environment perspective. Specifically for marginalized and under-resourced communities with which social workers predominantly find themselves engaged with, the burden to demonstrate resilience under adverse conditions may be both frequent and untenable. Thus, social workers sometimes challenge the as you were or as things were endpoint and reveal the interconnections between resilience and oppression. And then urban studies already looks at cities as complex and interdependent systems. So it follows that their approach to resilience is highly interdisciplinary and employs a range of concepts and methods, including engineering, ecology, social ecology, their perspectives of resilience. In particular, urban studies researchers employ a social ecological approach to resilience that kind of departs from these more equilibrium-centered models offered by engineering, and actually strive to embrace instability, conceiving as the social and the ecological as very interconnected, and addressing the complexity of these interdependencies with a social justice orientation, kind of challenging this idea of bounce back ability or returning to normal, and instead emphasizing kind of complex adaptation and transformation, as well as really questioning resilience for whom and for what, and where and why is this happening. So they really push resilience to transform rather than deepen the dynamics of inequality by kind of having a rigorous approach that centers equity in terms of not just assuming that resilience is inherently a good thing. And they look at resilience through a lot of different levels of analysis, particularly neighborhoods, communities, cities, and then regional networks and global networks as well of cities. So kind of bringing this all together and moving into our propositions, some similarities we found between this kind of review of the disciplinary approaches are that there really is this inherent capacity to adapt that's evident in both human, and a desire to adapt that's evident in both human and ecological systems, and an interdependency between those systems. There's also, between these different perspectives, a lot of tension, and they land in different locations among the tension between the status quo and the push to change or transform. So is resilience about maintaining status quo, or is it about a kind of bouncing forward better? And then kind of looking at the potential and the importance of looking at resilience as happening on multiple scales. So all the way from the individual to the global and everything in between. And also emphasizing that resilience itself is a distinct, phenomenon to look at, to maybe consider measuring or understanding, but it's also interconnected with broader social, political, economic, and material systems as well, which leads into our propositions.
So now we aim to draw lessons from this broad review of existing knowledge across disciplines. And so we describe 9 main propositions that we make to push the concept of resilience to another level. Propositions 1 through 3 argue for understanding resilience as an interactive dynamic that manifests both within and between systems. Proposition 4 speaks to the diversity of expertise needed to produce resilience. Propositions 5 through 6 address the tension between stability and change. And propositions 7 through 9 address learning from disruptions to promote resilience. The first 3 propositions address this question of resilience as an attribute versus process. The literature has, a lot of literatures have said that resilience is an attribute, and then there's been pushback that say that resilience is a process. We argue further that resilience is not in itself a process or an attribute, but rather is a dynamic of processes, orientations, and connections that spark, push, and define the direction of ongoing system operations. In this way, we can think of resilience as a dynamic vector shaping and flowing through systems. An example of this could be seen in the 2014 West Virginia water crisis or Elk River chemical spill, which there was a corporation that, by accident dumped a whole bunch of chemicals that seeped into the waterway and spilled downriver to Charleston and the municipalities around Charleston. So this shows how resilient systems have to balance static and emergent socio-technical components, along with organizational and ecological components and interactions, trying to insulate itself from disaster and then mitigate through treatment. So this encompasses the second proposition that resilience is not an attribute, but resilience relies on attributes or characteristics. So internal to a system, internal to the water system that was contaminated, there wasn't enough storage capacity to adjust and still have resilience to fires. So the attribute of storage capacity made a huge difference in what the possibilities were going to be for the systems to adjust. And once it cascaded outside of that initial system where there wasn't enough storage capacity to enhance fire resilience, it ends up bumping into all of these other systems. So now we have multiple water systems and multiple sectors and multiple different publics to communicate with. So that internal systems resilience is an important factor that then shows Proposition 3. Resilience is a function of interfaces and interactions between systems. So there's those internal components, which then interact with other systems, which have their own internal components. So it's not, to sum up these propositions, it's not that there's a system that has its resilience, but it's about all of these dynamic interfaces and the ways that they feed back upon each other, especially in moments of crisis. The fourth proposition gets at what happens when all of those complex interactions start happening. You need expertise from multiple different disciplinary perspectives and epistemologies. This is to say that no crisis or no complex circumstance can be dealt with just one perspective. There are tons of perspectives that have to be taken into account. And in the Elk River crisis, there was, despite being a boil water advisory where people were advised not to drink their water, and there was at least 5 days that everyone in the Charleston area didn't have viable drinking water. But then there's a communication factor that has to take place. People still, and there was a flushing advisory. So people are like flushing their toilets, but what they didn't realize initially was that that would expose people to particulates in the air. And so there was contamination in that way. That needs to be given in a feedback loop so that better guidance can be given by the system. And so multiple perspectives need to be taken into account. Oh, go back, Erin. I'm still going to say another word, because another example of this is the Flint water crisis, which is pivotal on everyone's mind still. When the public came to the officials and said, my water is the wrong color, this was not seen as expertise. This was seen as, oh, those poor Black people, we got to do our expertise. And so what we're advocating in these sets of propositions is seeing expertise by a much broader set of epistemologies that are needed to give the critical information to keep water clean. And this, as well, is true for the other elements of complex systems that go into the question of resilience. Okay, so now we'll move on to stability and change, this inherent tension. We propose that resilience can be a catalytic tension in the dynamic between stability and change, meaning resilience can ensure that stable systems remain stable, but when there's a tipping point, resilience is what makes change for systems to bounce forward better. And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at CRASC at the Community Resilience Center at George Mason University, including my esteemed mother who's watching this presentation today, the director, who seeded that idea for us of bouncing forward better. Because there's this question of, does resilience mean bouncing back? And at what point do you make a transformative change? We're not proposing a specific answer to that question of resilience versus renewal, like when they overlap and when they're distinctly different concepts. We're saying that resilience holds that complex set of tensions between when systems will adhere to being stable and when they will change. The sixth proposition is that resilience adheres to the status quo. And it's not, a lot of the rhetoric around resilience, a lot of the discourses publicly is that resilience is really a good thing. Like we all want to be resilient. And so we raise controversial counter to that to say resilience can also mean, when it adheres to the status quo, it can promote negative aspects of our society. So for instance, we say racism is a very resilient social system, and one that ensures that a large set of people in the US do not actually get clean water. So for instance, race is the strongest predictor of water and sanitation access in the US, with Native American households 19 times less likely than white households to have indoor plumbing, and Black and Latinx households twice less likely than white households to have indoor plumbing. Under-resourced communities must be quite resilient themselves, but they are required to be resilient while interfacing with systems of inequality and racism that are organized against them. So adherence to the status quo in many contexts means avoiding transformative change and maintaining an unequal and racist status quo. So resilience is not in itself either positive or negative, but our stepping back a bit allows us to see those dynamics in relief. And the last set of propositions have to do with learning. Thanks for coming, Rahul, to the presentation. Thanks. And so we propose that disruptions promote resilience to the degree they are managed and considered at both the system level and the system interface level. The way disruptions are treated internally in a system may determine if enhanced resilience is the outcome. And an interpretation and consideration process occurs as managers and decision makers examine and make sense of what happened. So routine events like low pressure events and water main breaks may not prompt the need for change, but if they prompt regulatory violations or occur in clusters, that's a different story. They'll absolutely promote change. And that leads to Proposition 8. Learning from disruptions may lead to change, which affects system resilience. To bounce back from a disruption is often necessary for the system to learn about new risks and what to do differently to maintain the integrity of the system going forward. Learning is the outcome of a process of consideration, which then affects change and resilience. At the same time, learning is expensive and there may be resistance. And finally, those disruptions that focus attention at the system and system interface levels create more opportunities for resilience. When disruptions are dramatic, large scale, and attention grabbing, they tend to create pressure for change. They may do so by bringing a particular policy issues for organizational deficiency to the attention of decision makers, as well as to the public. So depending on the scope and nature of event, water systems may call the need for change. And Flint, again, is a great example of this proposition. Learning from Flint focused people's attention on lead in drinking water in a way that even a larger scale crisis, such as the lead in drinking water in Washington, D.C., which affected many, many people and promoted change there. The D.C. event didn't focus the nation's attention in the same way that Flint did. And what happened after Flint is that Michigan enacted, a replacement of lead service lines all over the state. And many other systems also now see their events in relation to, across the country, think about avoiding being a case just like Flint. So these are the propositions that we have put together to grow the concept of resilience in a new direction. And I'll let Erin wrap up what we think we've learned from this project.
Yeah, what we think we've learned and are still trying to learn. So just kind of in conclusion, in this project, we looked at kind of synthesizing existing approaches, but also situating them within complex socio-technical systems and also within the broader ecosystem that drinking water systems are provided through. and also situating them within a multidisciplinary approach. So kind of really moving towards theorizing this resilience as inherently multidisciplinary, that it should kind of be researched as such and be implemented in community-based interventions and systems learning as a multidisciplinary, multi-expertise kind of concept. Also that it exists at multiple levels of human and system interaction, and that it's interconnected with other kind of components, as Allison, brought up, that it's interconnected with broader, social structures such as racism and oppression. And so it's not inherently good or bad, but it also needs to be kind of examined critically with regard to specific places, social, conditions, and that the need for resilience is not felt equally, and that there's a disparate impact in how crises are as these escalating social and natural crises are impacting different communities. So it needs to be examined as interconnected as well. So we kind of conclude by proposing this kind of framework, that not really framework, but kind of offer thinking about resilience at the system interface level as a way to further research it, as both looking at where is it happening within specific systems, and also where how is resilience, kind of flowing through in a process of the interactions between systems as well. So not looking at, bounded systems or bounded individuals, but at the interfaces that resilience happens at. And so we'll end there. And we've got a little under 10 minutes for discussion or questions. I'll stop this. We can see each other.
Yes. So thank you
all for listening.
Yeah, thank you. So that concludes the presentation portion, but as our presenters mentioned, we have entered the Q&A part. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and unmute your mic, or you can post any questions in the chat as well. So.
Yeah, I have a question. As you were giving your presentation, I was thinking about the people in Biloxi, Mississippi that don't have any water and haven't had it for a long time. Yet it seems that at the state level and the local level, there seems to have been like zip response. And I'm wondering, how could these people have not seen this coming?
When you say, first of all, this is a very important question, a very important issue. When you say, how did these people not see it coming, who do you mean? And what do you mean?
I mean the people who run the water systems. I mean, they must have known there were weaknesses there for quite a while, but they never seemed to want to have addressed them previously till there was a crisis. And all of a sudden, but they must have known that there was something wrong, yet they never seemed to want to have done repair beforehand. So is this resilience of the people, or is it or resistance from the authorities?
Yes, I think that it is an example by which we can learn a lot about resilience. And my mom says what happened with power in Texas was foreseeable too. And so these events, they can do what our Proposition 9, they can focus our attention on a set of questions about resilience. What does it mean to be resilient? Because there are ways that it's foreseeable, but we're dealing with a context in which the state doesn't have the ability to just fix everything for everybody. And so we're seeing the weaknesses in the system. And this is one of the things that Matt mentioned at the beginning about the Hurricane Katrina being a really important shift in saying, like, the government is not going to just come solve your problems, especially if you're Black and poor. You can't rely on some broader authority to come make sure you're okay. And so there was a pivotal shift in that 2005 moment of saying communities need local resilience as a matter of survival. But the question that you're bringing up is super important because it does show that disparity in question. Mississippi has been the poorest, blackest state of the United States pretty much since its inception, since the Civil War. So resources, where are our resources going? There are some people who never have to think about these questions. And there are other people who it means that one thing goes wrong and it's a cascading set of effects that you can never bounce back to normal. And you may not even have the prospect of bouncing forward better when you look at the reality of the complex dynamics of what it takes to actually be resilient and what disparity looks like in our country. So really your question is a lot of food for thought.
Yes, thank you. And I see a question in the chat here from Dr. Robbins about our decision to exclude the discipline of psychology, given the history and ongoing life of the concept in the field, and how this might inform your propositions. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we kind of decided to include psychology within kind of the overarching, like where did the concept of resilience even come from? And why has it become, why is there this surge in examining it? And also kind of looked at the perspective at social work as kind of carrying on, that perspective originally offered through psychology, and of course still examined in psychology. The other kind of more practical decision making was kind of around, in the beginning we did mention that like this project came both out of a need for, we as an interdisciplinary team made up of most of the disciplines that we talked about today, are tasked with understanding the resilience as it relates to interconnections between water and public health systems, yet had a hard time finding anything about that in the literature. And so it was both kind of how can we make a contribution to this larger, research around resilience, but also kind of how can we solve this problem for us as a team? Like, so how do we work through what are our different approaches that we're bringing to the, proverbial table in carrying out this study, and how are those approaches informing how we're, how we're collecting data, how we're analyzing it within our specific study as well. So it was kind of, both a more global decision, but also very much a practical consideration.
There was a point we had to bound the number of disciplines that we were looking at as well. So it's not to say that the disciplines that aren't represented here are not highly relevant. It is to say that we tried to get a good cross-section of perspectives that would allow us to diversify the perspective of resilience in a strong way.
Yeah,
particularly Michael has a question which says that psychology includes community psychology, which is like a macro social work, looking at social resilience. It's more a comment, but I don't know if you want to comment on that comment.
I mean, that's helpful in terms of the levels of analysis issue, because a lot of, and it is to say also that the authors of this paper are not learned in psychology. So we have what we had learned in the research was there was a heavy emphasis, especially in the origins of resilience, on psychology, resilience in psychology as an individual characteristic. So what you're saying about psychology, including community psychology and that macro scale, it just shows that resilience does have all of these different trajectories that are independent. It's not like resilience comes from one place and then everybody builds a foundation on it. There's multiple originations of resilience that stem into sort of many branches. And so again, that it's highly relevant to think about community psychology. And we look for scholars to build on the small foundation that we're creating to grow this area of research and show, it's relevant even more across disciplines. One of the main challenges of this paper was staging an interdisciplinary conversation. So much as young scholars, people have said to us on this team, and since the beginning of my academic career, interdisciplinarity, people have been trying to do that for decades. It doesn't work. And so we really pushed we tried to be realistic about our expectations for what it looks like to stage an interdisciplinary conversation. And it was very challenging. As I said, all of the colleagues from our world team contributed from their disciplines, and we were able to build on top of that. And it absolutely wouldn't have been possible to gain the type of foundation that we did to grow the concept of resilience and put these propositions forward without that interdisciplinary conversation. But we were not trying to be comprehensive in doing that. We were trying to be a little bit measured and practical as well. And I guess we're at 1:30, so I don't see any other questions in the chat either. I'll leave it. If somebody wants a last word, you're welcome to take a few more minutes to do that by my clock. But I just want to say I really appreciate this wonderful audience and the enthusiasm about this work. We're really excited to get a chance to share it with you and share the paper going forward.
And thank you for enlightening us about the importance and the ubiquity of resilience across disciplines. I was also tempted to talk about, to put down that linguistics and humanities are disciplines that could be embraced by resilience. Linguistic resilience and sort of human resilience in the humanities. So thank you for this. As director, I need to sort of do a little self-promotion. We put in the chat our instrument for you to sign up for next year's series of talks. If you enjoy this talk and the format it was delivered in, feel free to sign up. In the fall, we will allow people to either choose between virtual presentation or in-person presentation. We are hoping that by the winter semester next year, we will be back fully in person. So thank you so much for the talk. And I think Kennedy has a little spiel that she gives at the end of each presentation.
Yes, thank you to both of our speakers. This was a wonderful, well-crafted presentation and very interactive too. We're so lucky and fortunate to be able to give you two and your partners and everyone that was involved in this research, the platform to share. That's what we do, and that's why we have the Humanities Center. So we're fortunate to be able to work with you. But on behalf of the Humanities Center, we do want to say thank you to both of you. And as a small token of our gratitude, we do have two gifts for you. It's a mask and a journal with our Humanities Center logo. Well, we give it to all our presenters, but we hope you wear it with pride, and we're going to be reaching out to both of you and whoever else was a part of this too, if you want to include them individually towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to you, COVID. So, but anyways, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience as well. Again, very interactive and fascinating presentation. And if there's any last words from you or our speakers, Dr. Edwards, get ended here.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Stay safe.
All right. And this is being recorded for everyone, and it will be posted towards the end of the week. So everyone have a good one.
Thank your mom for showing up.
Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kennedy. Thanks, Dr. Edwards. Really wonderful to be here.
Yes, of course.